After years of negotiations back and forth, the European Union has overnight agreed to fast-track negotiations with Australia for a free trade deal. These were talks held in the sidelines of the NATO summit in Madrid. Further negotiations will now take place for Australia to gain access to Europe's $24 trillion market. But, I know this personally, there is a sting in the tail. To discuss this and more, Sky contributor Kosha Garda joins me and the Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, Nick Cater. Well, there's no doubt, Nick, Europe's a massive market, sure, but I remember very clearly from the Abbott era, there's a lot of climate hooks they want. It's not just a trade deal. And when this was put to Tony Abbott, when these talks first started after the 2013 election, he said, I'm not going to play ball. I'm interested in a trade deal, but Australians are not voting for this sort of climate action. This is not what they elected me to do. And so we sort of pushed back to the Europeans and moved instead on the China deal, the South Korean deal and the Japanese deal. But here we go again.
Because the trouble with the EU, as you know well, Peter, is you're not dealing with one country. You're dealing with 27 countries, each of which have a veto to this arrangement. So you're back in the days really of a multilateral trade negotiation. We know none of those really ended very well. It was the unilateral deals, which, you know, to his great credit, Tony Abbott began, that have actually worked. So there's your problem number one. The idea, I thought Anthony Albanese saying that the EU had agreed to fast-track our application. You know, the words fast-track and the EU just don't go together, do they? We know how long it took Britain just to leave the joint. So, you know, I think that the climate clause is just merely a ruse for old-fashioned protectionism. The Italians want to stop us using the words Prosecco in our wine. The Greeks want to stop us using feta, and everybody wants to keep our dairy out. So, you know, on it goes. I don't think we should be fooled by this or waste too much energy on it, frankly.
And Kosha, I mean, Nick makes a point. This is a bilateral trade deal, although the bilateral part's with a multilateral EU grouping, but it's a trade bilat. We've already got all these UN climate agreements. Why on earth are we going to start to confuse trade with more and more bogus climate targets? I mean, and look at Europe right now, scrambling back as fast as they can to coal and gas.
That's right. We shouldn't, but I think anchoring the climate agenda into everything from free trade agreements to corporate strategy is something that we're just going to see more and more of, because true demand for renewables versus fossil fuels is just not where governments and activists and advocates want it to be. So you're going to see these kinds of things shoehorned in here. The other problem, too, Peter, is it really does disproportionately affect Australia, because Australia is a resource-heavy economy, a coal-heavy economy in particular. On the flip side, only 25 million people. So let's be real, no matter what we do, it doesn't make, it's really not going to make a dent on the global climate one way or another. So this is just more showboating, I think, and it's very easy to commit to it because these net zero 2030, 2050 type goals, the people agreeing to those goals today aren't even going to be around or in office back then. So it's really easy to commit to it, and all it does is saddle future generations with the economic repercussions of these measures.
And worst, of course, if it's in legislation, as Anthony Albanese proposes when Parliament returns in July. Nick, what about these ABS stats out there today? 480,000 jobs going big, 480,000 jobs, but we've got nearly 1 million Australians on the dole. Why are we paying people the dole when business are desperate for workers?
Well, you ask yourself that question, and what can we do actually to, you know, make the dole arrangements even tighter to encourage people into the workforce, because you just get the impression that some people are just, you know, having a lend to the taxpayer here, don't you? But, and, you know, I think it was a problem during COVID. We heard employers talk about the fact that, you know, the generous COVID welfare arrangements had made people less willing to work. There's a bit of that going around. But fundamentally, I think we've existed for years making up for the labour shortage with more and more more and more immigration, and clearly that is unsustainable over the long term. We need to keep our immigration levels in check. COVID has perhaps done that for us, and we need to look at how to turn other Australians to productive, you know, jobs. And as we know, a lot of people over 65, pensioners, would really like to get back in the workplace and feel active. If we could actually do something about, you know, the fact that they lose some of their pension if they go back to work. So I think Peter Dutton's initiative on this is very, very, very positive.
Yeah, for the life of me, Kosha, I can't understand. Government has a review or an inquiry or a report or a plan on everything, but we don't have a population plan. So if we've got 500,000 jobs and we've got almost 1 million unemployed, and businesses saying, let's just bring in more migrants, which drives up their demand and keeps wages low. I mean, we know what they're wanting the migrants for. We've got all these issues with infrastructure. If we had a plan, we might say, let's increase our population over the next 10 years, but build the infrastructure before we get the people here. But this idea that we don't have a plan at the federal government, and neither side of politics wants a plan, that says to me we need to have a plan. If the politicians don't want it and they're in cahoots that they don't want it, that means more than ever we must have a plan.
It's so true. And this trend is something you see in liberal democracies everywhere. Both sides of the aisle, as you mentioned, is so quick to leap to immigration as the answer to the labor shortage always, because it's cheap, easy. Everybody loves cheap labor. The business lobby, Republicans, Democrats, if you look at it back in the US as an example. And there is no plan because that is the agenda for different reasons, sometimes overlapping, sometimes not. There is an agenda for why we want more immigration, the impact that has to the country more broadly, far beyond labor. And I think, it's no coincidence that you see that. And as Nick mentioned, the other issue too is we have to look at it holistically. It's not just about closing the labor shortage. It is about infrastructure, what it's doing to the public health system, the ambulance shortage that you just covered previously. All of that bears the brunt of this. And I think it's quite telling that there isn't a plan.
Hey, Nick, just quickly, surprise, surprise, we've got a respected whistleblower that says our carbon credit scheme, this is where business spend a lot of money to buy an offset from their emissions. It's an idea to reduce emissions, financial penalties. It's in such trouble, considered fraudulent. There's now a big review headed by the former chief scientist into this system. We know overseas in the EU we had Eastern European crime gangs involved in these carbon credit schemes. I think they're a shonk's paradise. I'd scrap the lot.
Well, there's got to be a serious review, Peter. They've got to get the regulations tightened up. But believe me, the potential for genuine carbon sequestration in this country is huge. It just has to be measured and monitored correctly and done with productive farmland, not setting aside forests. It's a long topic. We should go into this some other time.
All right, quick break. I have to leave it there. Kosha Gada, Nick Cater, thank you for your time. Have a great weekend.